She had memorized every book he never opened. He asked her to read one to him. When Eleanor Marsh walked through the gate of Ashford Park on the 9th of November, carrying a leather bag that held everything she owned, nobody at the estate paid her any particular attention. The gatekeeper waved her through without looking up from his pipe. The footman who led her to the housekeeper's parlor did not ask her name. A woman arriving for a domestic position in a house of 68 rooms and 32 servants was the most unremarkable thing in the world. And Eleanor Marsh was, by most accounts, a deeply unremarkable woman. She was used to this. She had spent 24 years being the kind of person other people looked past, not with cruelty, simply the way one looks past familiar furniture or a long-known shadow on a wall. Invisible, present, but unnoticed. She had learned, early and thoroughly, that invisibility was its own kind of safety. What nobody at Ashford Park understood on that gray morning, not the gatekeeper with his pipe, not the footman with his indifferent instructions, not even Eleanor herself, was that the woman walking through those gates was about to alter the course of the Duke of Ashford's life in ways that would still be spoken of 40 years later. What exactly did she do? What did she say in that cold library on a night when she ought to have been asleep and he ought never to have been there at all? And why, when a man who had never asked anyone for anything in his adult life finally broke that habit, did he choose to ask her? That is precisely what this story will answer. The position had been offered through an employment agency in Bath, a notice so brief and impersonal that Eleanor had read it 3 times, certain she had misunderstood. Required, a woman of education and discretion, to catalogue and manage the private library and historical archive of a country estate in Wiltshire. Knowledge of French and Latin preferred. References required. Salary, £30 per annum, with room and board. £30. It was more than she had earned in 2 years combined. She had sent her letter that same afternoon, writing it on the back of her last sheet of clean paper, borrowing the post fee from the landlady of the rooming house where she had been staying since Reverend Marsh's death the previous spring.
The Reverend had been the only family she had known, a quiet, bespectacled man who had raised her from the age of 3 after her mother died, who had taught her Greek and Latin alongside his sermons with the same earnest conviction he gave to all things, and who had left her, upon his death, exactly the contents of his study and £2 4 shillings. She had sold the books to pay his burial fees, all of them but one. The one she kept was not his. It had been her mother's. It was a small leather journal, dark brown and worn soft at the corners, the clasp long since broken and held shut with a length of faded green ribbon. Eleanor did not know who her mother had been. The Reverend had given her a name, Anne, and very little else. But she knew the handwriting in that journal with the intimacy of someone who has read the same pages 100 times by candlelight. Neat, careful letters, slightly formal, the kind of hand taught by a governess rather than a village schoolroom. Whoever Anne had been, she had been educated. She had written in English and in French, and in a handful of startling passages near the end of the journal, in Italian. Eleanor had taught herself Italian from those pages. She had spent the weeks after the Reverend's death doing what she had always done when frightened. She had found whatever work was available, and she had not permitted herself to stop. She had catalogued the library of a solicitor's widow in Bath who had been too overwhelmed to manage it herself. She had translated a French contract for a merchant who could not afford a proper translator. She had taught reading to the daughters of a dressmaker who had heard somehow that she was clever with languages. It was not a life. It was a series of small survivals, each one keeping her upright until the next. The letter from the employment agency arrived 2 weeks after she sent her own. She was to present herself at Ashford Park, Wiltshire, on the 9th of November, and to ask for Mrs. Price, the head housekeeper. Eleanor packed her bag that evening. The journal went in first, wrapped in her spare shawl, positioned at the very bottom where it could not be jostled. Then her 2 dresses, one gray wool, one brown linen, her small Bible, her comb, her pen, and the remaining ink she had decanted into a smaller bottle to save weight. The employment agency's letter, folded 3 times, tucked into her coat pocket. She did not sleep particularly well that night. But she was at the gate on the 9th of November, as instructed, and she walked through it carrying everything she was. Mrs. Price received her in the housekeeper's room, a neat, dark chamber that smelled of beeswax and cold stone. The woman herself was exactly what Eleanor might have predicted from the tone of the employment notice: precise, efficient, and without warmth of a kind that needed to be displayed. She was perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pinned back with the severity of a person who considers appearance a professional matter rather than a personal one, and steady eyes that took Eleanor's measure in approximately 4 seconds and found the sum acceptable, if unremarkable. "Miss Marsh," she said, not rising from her chair, "you come from Bath. You have a reference from Mrs. Aldgate and another from a Reverend Thomas Marsh, who I understand is deceased." "He is," Eleanor said. "He was my guardian. He raised me from infancy." "And before him?" "I have no recollection before him." Mrs. Price's expression did not change. "The position is to organize and catalogue His Grace's library and archive. The library has not been properly managed in some years. The archive has not been touched in longer. You will work under my authority in all domestic matters, and under the direction of His Grace in matters pertaining to the library." She paused. "His Grace does not direct in any ordinary sense of the word. He simply expects." "I understand," Eleanor said. "I doubt that you do, entirely, but you will come to." Mrs. Price rose and smoothed her skirts. "Your room is in the east wing, alongside the other upper servants. You will take your meals in the servants' hall. You are not to enter the family rooms without specific instruction. You are not to speak to His Grace unless he speaks to you first." A brief pause. "Do you have questions?" Eleanor had a great many questions. She asked none of them. "Good," said Mrs. Price. "Then you may begin tomorrow." The room she was shown to was small and cold, with a window that looked onto a grey courtyard. There was a bed, a washstand, a chair, and a writing table. The fireplace had not been lit. The walls were bare stone. Outside, the elm trees in the park were bare of leaves, and the sky was the particular flat grey of November in the English countryside, the kind of sky that makes no promises about what comes next. Eleanor set her bag on the bed and looked at the room for a long moment. She had stayed in worse places.
She had slept in a rooming house in Bath where the roof leaked, and the woman in the next room argued with her husband every night until 2 in the morning. She had stayed for 3 weeks in a curate's spare room that was also the storage room, and she had done her reading by the light of a tallow candle, surrounded by packing crates. This was not worse. This was simply new. This was a room in a house so large she had counted 14 chimneys on the approach down the drive. A house with a library that no one had properly catalogued. A house where someone needed someone precisely like her. She would be all right. She told herself this firmly, the way she had always told herself things firmly when she was not entirely sure they were true. Then she unpacked her bag, changed into her second dress, and went to find the servants' hall for supper. Could Eleanor have guessed, on that first evening, sitting at the long servants' table with a bowl of beef broth and a piece of bread, listening to the careful silence of people who had not yet decided whether to include her? Could she have guessed what the house already held, what the library was about to show her? Or was it better, perhaps, that she arrived not knowing? The library was on the second floor of the east wing, accessible by a narrow corridor that the footman used for morning deliveries. Eleanor found it on her first full day at Ashford Park, led by a footman named Thomas, who opened the door, said, "There it is, miss," and retreated as though the room had committed some personal offense against him. Eleanor understood why the moment she stepped inside. It was a magnificent room, high-ceilinged, paneled in dark oak, with long windows looking out over the walled garden. 3 walls were floor-to-ceiling shelves, and the fourth held a fireplace, above which a painted coat of arms had been mounted, faded now to a dim ochre and gray. The furniture was heavy and well-made and very old. A reading table large enough to serve as a small boat, leather chairs worn to the color of dark honey, a stepladder on wheels that had been pushed into a corner and apparently forgotten. The books were chaos. Not dramatic, overturned chaos, simply the quiet, accumulated disorder of a room that nobody had cared for in a very long time. Volumes had been shelved horizontally atop other volumes. Folios stood beside pamphlets.
3 books had been left open, face down, on the reading table. Their spines were cracked, which meant they had been left that way for months, perhaps considerably longer. A Latin grammar stood next to a collection of French poetry. A German dictionary leaned against a Venetian travel memoir. There were stacks on the floor beside the far shelves, waiting to be returned to places that no longer existed. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment. She thought, this will take 3 months. She thought, I will enjoy every single day of it. She set down her notebook and her pen case, rolled up her sleeves, and began. The first week was inventory. She worked from 9 in the morning until the supper bell, methodically pulling volumes from shelves and recording titles and languages and approximate dates of publication in the neat, compact hand she used for catalog work. The library held, as best she could count, something in the order of 2,300 books. Approximately 200 were in Latin, another 300 in French. She found a small but beautifully curated section in Italian, mostly poetry and travel accounts, and a handful of works in Greek, some classical and some more recent. The remainder were in English: history, natural philosophy, estate management, law, theology, a great deal of military history, and a surprising quantity of botanical illustration. Almost none of them had been opened recently. The pages were stiff. Some volumes still had their pages uncut. A small, quiet part of her mind turned toward this and stayed there. Someone had acquired all of this, had brought it here, shelved it, and then simply not read it. She could not think of a sadder thing in a house than a room full of books that had never been opened. She did not ask about it. She catalogued. On the 8th night of her employment at Ashford Park, Eleanor could not sleep. This happened to her sometimes when a new place was still strange, when the sounds of an unfamiliar house had not yet become ordinary, when the creak of the floorboard outside her door was still cause for attention rather than background. She lay in the dark for an hour, listening to the wind moving through the park, and then gave up, pulled on her dressing gown and her thickest shawl, lit her candle, and went to the library. She had been reading Virgil's Aeneid in the evenings. The library held a beautiful edition of it, the kind of book that ought to have been read by now, and evidently had not. And she settled herself in the leather chair nearest the cold fireplace, tucked her feet underneath her, and opened to the first page. The fire had gone out hours ago. The room was cold enough that she could see her breath when she exhaled. She pulled her shawl tighter and read anyway. Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus ab oris. She read quietly, not quite silently, her lips shaping the words. She had always read Latin this way, as though it were a living language with breath in it, rather than merely grammar. The Reverend had taught her that. Latin that is never spoken, he had said once, settling into his armchair with a volume of Cicero, becomes dust. Read it as though the man is in the room. She had never been able to unlearn that particular instruction. She read it as something alive. She did not hear the door. She did not hear the footstep on the parquet, or the pause, or the sharp inhalation of a man who had not expected to find anyone in his library at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. What she finally heard was a voice. "What are you doing in here?" Eleanor looked up. He was standing 6 feet away, still in his evening coat. He had clearly come from the dining room, or perhaps a sitting room not long before, holding a glass of something amber, and looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. He was tall, dark-haired, and not particularly young, perhaps 33 or 34, and he had the particular posture of a man accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him rather than the other way around. She stood up immediately. The Virgil slid from her lap to the floor. "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." She bent to retrieve it and held it in front of her, which she immediately recognized as somewhat absurd. "I could not sleep. I came to—" She stopped. "I am sorry. I should not have been here at this hour." The Duke looked at the book in her hands, then at her, then at the book again. "Can you actually read that?" he said. The question surprised her. She looked down at the Virgil. "Yes," she said. "In Latin," he said. "Not a translation." "Yes," she said.
I was reading the original. Your Grace's edition is the Hain. The commentary is in the margins in several places.
Someone has added notes in German here. She turned the book and held it toward what little light remained in the fireplace. I have been trying to determine whether the handwriting is your father's or your grandfather's. Silence. The Duke set his glass on the reading table. He walked toward her until he was standing close enough that she could see the detail of the crest on his coat button, and he looked at the page she was holding out. His eyes moved over the German marginalia for a moment, and something in his face shifted. Not softened, exactly, but altered in a way she could not name. "My father's," he said at last. "I thought as much. The formation of the letter E—" She stopped herself. "Forgive me, it is late." He did not read German, the Duke said. He was not speaking to her anymore, not really. He was looking at the page with an expression that had nothing to do with the page itself. He had someone translate. He always had someone translate things for him. Eleanor stood very still and said nothing. She had learned, early and by necessity, that certain kinds of silence required a witness rather than a response. The Duke looked up. The expression on his face was difficult to categorize. Not uncomfortable, precisely, but present in a way that was unusual for a man who had, in Eleanor's brief observation of him passing through corridors and hallways, made a practiced art of being absent from a room, even while standing in it. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Read it," he said, "from the beginning." She looked at him for just a moment. "Please," he said. The word came out with the slightly awkward quality of something that does not get much use. Eleanor opened the book. She found the first line. She read, "Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus ab oris, Italiam fato profugus, lavinaque venit litora." She read for nearly an hour. He did not move from the chair he had taken across the table from her. At some point, the last of the fireplace embers went dark, and neither of them reached for more wood. When she finally paused at the end of the first book, the room was cold again, and her candle had burned more than halfway down. "You can stop," he said. His voice was quieter than before. "Yes, Your Grace." The silence stretched. The house was completely still around them. "You know the scholarly argument," he said, "about proper translation."
"I prefer to read it as Virgil wrote it," she said, before she thought carefully about whether that was wise. "Translation is always someone else's interpretation. I would rather have the original imperfectly understood than a perfect understanding of what someone else decided it meant." The Duke looked at her for a moment. "Where did you study?" "I did not study anywhere formal. My guardian taught me. He was a clergyman. He believed in Latin the way some men believe in cold baths, bracing, non-negotiable, and ultimately good for the character." Something, almost nothing, moved in the Duke's face. "And Greek?" "Some Greek," she said. "Less than my Latin." "Come back tomorrow," he said. He rose, picked up his glass, and walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and turned back, briefly. "Bring the book." He left. Eleanor sat in the cold library for a long moment after she heard his footsteps recede down the corridor. She was aware of two things at once: that she had just done something quite unusual, and that she had not, until this moment, wanted anything inconsiderably longer than she could account for. She set the Virgil carefully on the reading table, stood, wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, and took her candle back to her room. She did not sleep for a long time after. Had the Duke of Ashford ever, in his 33 years, asked another person to simply read to him? And if not, what was it about that night, about the cold room and the Virgil and the woman who sat in his chair as though she had every right to be there, that made him ask? The first month at Ashford Park was made of two things at once: warmth in the library and cold everywhere else. Eleanor came to understand the house in the way she came to understand all places she had lived in, not by being told about them, but by watching, listening, and noticing what people did not say as much as what they did. The servants' hall had its own hierarchy, as rigid as anything in the rooms above. Thomas the footman was cautiously friendly. The two parlor maids, Bess and Annie, spoke to each other, but rarely to Eleanor. The cook,
a capable woman called Mrs. Hawthorne, was neutral in the way that warm-natured people are sometimes neutral when they are occupied. Not unfriendly, simply busy in a life that had not yet included Eleanor. Mrs. Hawthorne.
Price was present as a kind of permanent weather system. She did not prevent Eleanor from going about her work, but her silence on any subject not strictly professional communicated a great deal without requiring words. Eleanor noticed, without great distress, that she had been assigned the coldest room in the east wing. She noticed that the extra woolen blanket she had requested had been forgotten 3 times before she stopped mentioning it. She noticed that when the footman brought morning tea to the other upper servants, he did not bring it to the library. None of these things were deliberate, she thought. Or rather, they might be, or they might simply be the natural accumulation of a house that had had no reason to make space for her before she arrived. Either way, the effect was the same. Ashford Park was large and old and full of itself in the way that very old houses sometimes are, and Eleanor was not yet any part of it. She kept warm in the library. The Duke came in the evenings. Not every evening, and not at a fixed hour. He appeared when he appeared, and Eleanor learned quickly that his arrivals had nothing to do with her work schedule, and everything to do with whatever aspect of his day had made the company of an open fire and a reading table preferable to everything else the house offered. He was, she gathered from careful observation, not a sociable man. He had no regular guests. He dined alone. He rode in the mornings before the house was fully awake, returning well past the breakfast hour with mud on his boots and an expression that suggested the ride had helped but not solved whatever problem had sent him out. He spent his days in his study, or in meetings with his estate manager, or his solicitor, a precise man named Mr. Aldgate, who drove up from the market town twice a week in a very neat black carriage, and who always left looking slightly more burdened than when he arrived. When the Duke came to the library, he sat in the chair across from Eleanor, and she read. They had progressed, by the 4th week, from the Aeneid to Ovid's Metamorphoses to a French history of the Roman Republic that Eleanor had found misfiled beneath a pile of botanical texts, and then, at the Duke's quiet direction, to a collection of Italian verse that had been sitting on the shelf behind the footstool, untouched since what appeared to be the previous century. Eleanor had been translating as she read. Her Italian was less automatic than her Latin, and the Duke had said, on the 3rd evening of this, entirely without preface, "You're doing it wrong." Eleanor looked up. "The 2nd line," he said. "You are rushing the pause in the middle." She looked at the page, read the line again silently. "You are right," she said. He looked slightly surprised that she had agreed without hesitation. "Do you read Italian?" she asked. "My mother insisted on lessons from the age of 8. I have retained the reading rather better than the speaking." A pause. "Continue." She continued. These evenings occupied her thoughts in ways she tried not to examine too closely. They were professional. He was her employer. She sat in the library and read, and that was, as far as any account of the situation was concerned, the complete and entire description of it. He never asked her a personal question after that first night, and she never offered anything personal. They spoke about the texts. Occasionally they disagreed about translation. Occasionally one of them said something that was nearly amusing, and the other acknowledged it with a slight movement at the corner of the mouth, which Eleanor was beginning to suspect was as close as the Duke of Ashford ordinarily came to a smile. She told herself it was simply a good position. She told herself she was fortunate. She told herself it was nothing unusual at all. But there were moments, sitting in the amber light of the library with the fire going well and a book open between them, when Eleanor had the uncomfortable sensation of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Not safe, exactly. Not settled. But specific. Present. Herself in this particular room at this particular hour, as though some arrangement she had not been consulted about had nonetheless taken her preferences into account. She did not know what to do with that sensation, so she continued cataloging. By the end of the 4th week, she had organized approximately 400 volumes and had found in the process 3 works she was reasonably certain were of significance. A mid-17th century French manuscript that appeared to be unpublished, a collection of what seemed to be original letters from a minor Italian Renaissance figure.
And wedged behind the botanical texts, a slim folio in Latin bearing no title on its spine, which appeared from a brief examination to contain a private account of estate transactions going back 100 years or more. She had flagged all 3 and left notes on the reading table. The Duke had read the notes. He had said, "Good." He had said nothing else, but Mr. Aldgate had arrived the following week with 2 colleagues and spent 4 hours with the French manuscript. When he left, his expression was not its usual harried quality. It was satisfied. Mrs. Price found Eleanor in the corridor outside the linen room on a gray Thursday morning and told her, in so many words, that she was making a mistake. Not with those precise words. Mrs. Price's exact statement was, "His Grace values efficiency, Miss Marsh, not companionship." "I understand, Mrs. Price," Eleanor said. "I do not think," Mrs. Price said, smoothing the front of her apron with the steady hands of a woman who has managed large houses for 30 years and does not require her composure to be worked at anymore, "that you entirely do. Women in your kind of position, women who are educated but not born to it, who are useful to a household but have no standing within it, such women are most secure when they remain professional. His Grace will not remember in 6 months that you are here. It would be best if you also did not find that a surprise when it comes." The corridor was cold. It smelled of lavender water and old stone. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Price for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "I will bear that in mind." She went back to the library and picked up where she had left off. She noted, without intending to, that Mrs. Price's warning had made her want to prove something. She also noted that this was precisely the variety of wanting that caused sensible women to do things that were not sensible at all. She turned a page and kept walking. And so, Mrs. Price believed she understood the situation fully. But was she right about Eleanor? Was Eleanor the kind of woman who could be warned away from things that were worth having? Or had she spent too many years being invisible to believe even now that what she was reaching toward was anything she was allowed to keep? It was the Italian document that changed things. Eleanor found it on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of December, at the bottom of a wooden box of unprocessed papers stored at the back of the archive room, a small, cold chamber adjoining the library proper, crowded with boxes and rolled documents that appeared not to have been examined since the current Duke's father had held the title. The box was labeled with a date from nearly 30 years before. Most of its contents were routine household accounts. The document was at the very bottom, folded into thirds and tied with a faded red ribbon in the manner of Italian legal papers. Eleanor untied the ribbon carefully. The paper was good quality, not fragile, and the writing was a clear legal hand in black ink that had faded only slightly to brown at the edges. She read the first paragraph, and then stopped. She read it again. Then she sat back in the cold archive chair and thought very carefully about what she was holding. It appeared to be a deed of trust. The Ashford estate, or rather a portion of it, specifically the southern Water Meadow acreage and 2 associated tenant farms, had been placed nearly 70 years ago into a separate trust arrangement by the current Duke's great-grandfather, who had spent time in Venice and acquired certain properties and certain attachments there. The trust had been established for the benefit of a woman named Julia Mancini, described as a widow of Venetian origin, and her descendants. It contained an expiration clause. The trust reverted to the main estate title after 3 generations, unless certain conditions were met. 3 generations. The current Duke was the 4th-generation descendant of the man who created the trust. Eleanor sat in the cold room and was very still for a long moment. Then she took out her notebook and began to translate. She worked all morning, writing carefully, checking her Italian against the passages she was least certain of, and noting the original phrases alongside her translation. By midday, she had a clean copy she was confident was accurate. She read it through once more, made 3 small corrections, and added a note. This document appears authentic, and, as far as I can determine, unregistered. The conditions described would affect current title to the southern water meadows and tenant farms numbered 7 and 8. It is possible this has never been presented to English solicitors.
I would recommend it be examined by a professional with knowledge of both English and Italian property law. She left the translation and the original document side by side on the reading table. When the Duke came to the library that evening, he did not sit down. He stood at the table and read the document. Then he read Eleanor's translation. Then he read the original again.
The fire burned steadily behind him. The room smelled of wood smoke and old leather and the particular dry coolness of aged paper. He was silent for a long time. "Where did you find this?" he said at last. "In the archive box," Eleanor said. "The one marked with the date. It was at the bottom, underneath a collection of household accounts." "You translated this yourself?" "Yes." "Today?" "This morning," she said. Another silence. The fire cracked and settled. "This is significant," he said. "I believe so, Your Grace. I may be wrong about the legal implications. I am not a solicitor. But the document appears authentic, and if it is, it suggests there may be a claim against the estate that has simply never been raised, because no one who could read it has encountered it." "Or someone knew about it and put it in a box," he said. Eleanor had considered this. "Also possible," she said. The Duke's expression was difficult to read, as it generally was, but there was something new in it. Not warmth exactly. Attention. The particular, focused attention of a man who has quietly revised a calculation. "I will send for Aldgate," he said. He picked up Eleanor's translation and folded it with his own hands, with care. "You will be present for the meeting. I may need you to explain the original text." "Of course," she said. He took the document and the translation and left. The footman who brought Eleanor supper that night, for the first time, also brought a small pot of tea. She did not think it was a coincidence. She sat at the meeting with Mr. Aldgate 3 days later, at the estate office table that smelled of leather and pipe smoke and winter, and explained the Italian text with the precision of someone who has spent a week preparing for a conversation that was not yet known to be coming. Mr. Aldgate asked excellent questions. Eleanor answered them. The Duke sat at the head of the table and said nothing, but she was aware, at several points, of him watching her with the same focused quality she had noticed in the library. When Mr.
Aldgate left, he said to the Duke, "Where did you find her?" The Duke said, "She found me." Eleanor was in the corridor, returning to the library when she heard this. She filed it away in the same place she had been filing other things she was not yet certain what to do with, and she went back to work. Mr. Aldgate was an experienced solicitor who recognized talent the moment he saw it. But talent in a woman of no apparent family or standing was, in the year 1819, a complicated kind of thing. Did Eleanor understand yet what her skill had just cost her in terms of other people's ease? Or was she still, at that point, only doing her job? The warning came on a Thursday evening in the second week of January, and it came, as Eleanor might have predicted, from Mrs. Price. Eleanor had stayed in the library later than usual. The Duke had not come that evening, which happened sometimes, and she had fallen into the deep, time-dissolving state that good archival work produces, where the hours pass without making themselves known. When she finally looked up, the house had gone fully quiet around her. She gathered her notebook and her pen case, extinguished the library candles except one, and made her way back to the east wing. Mrs. Price was waiting in the corridor outside Eleanor's door. Eleanor stopped. The head housekeeper was dressed as she always dressed, collar and cuffs impeccable, keys at her belt, expression at its usual careful temperature. But she was standing, not passing through, which meant she had come here with a specific purpose and had been waiting. "Mrs. Price," Eleanor said. "A moment, if you will, Miss Marsh." Eleanor opened her door and they went in. The room was cold. The fire had gone out hours ago. Mrs. Price stood near the washstand and did not sit. "I wish to speak to you before the Dowager Duchess arrives," she said. Eleanor had not known the Dowager Duchess was coming. "When is she expected?" "The end of the month. She visits every winter for 6 weeks." Mrs. Price paused in the way of someone choosing words with particular care. "Lady Margaret is not unkind, precisely, but she is particular about this household, about who is in it and in what capacity." She paused again. "She will find your situation irregular." "In what sense?" Eleanor asked. "A woman of your background, with daily access to His Grace's private library, attending meetings with his solicitors, working in the estate archive." "Mrs." Price looked at Eleanor directly. "It is not customary." "I was hired to manage the library," Eleanor said. "You were hired to catalog it," Mrs. Price said.
The distinction was made gently, which Eleanor found somehow worse than if it had been made sharply. "You have become considerably more involved than that." She straightened slightly. "I am not suggesting you have done wrong. I am telling you, as plainly as I can, that the Dowager Duchess will not see your situation as you see it. She will make inquiries about your background. She will ask questions. Women without clear family histories—" She paused. "Women in your position are vulnerable to a certain kind of scrutiny. I am telling you this so that you are not surprised by it when it comes." The cold room was very still. Eleanor could hear the wind in the elm trees outside the window. She thought, she knows something about me. Or she suspects it. "Thank you, Mrs. Price," she said. "I appreciate the warning." After the housekeeper left, Eleanor sat on the edge of her bed in her coat. She had not taken it off, the room was too cold, and thought carefully and without hurrying. She was not precisely surprised by what Mrs. Price had said. She had understood from the beginning that her position was unusual, and that unusual positions attracted a particular quality of attention. She had no family. She had no known parentage beyond the Reverend, who was dead, and who had, in his gentle and careful way, told her almost nothing. She had grown up knowing that the question of who she was, not what she could do, not the texture of her character or the reach of her mind, but the specific origin of her existence, was a vulnerability. People used it in different ways. Some used it with cruelty and some with pity, and both were uncomfortable in their own particular manner. She thought about the journal at the bottom of her bag, wrapped in its shawl. She thought about the Italian passages, the hurried handwriting in those last pages. She thought, whoever you were, Anne, I have not stopped trying to understand you. She took out the journal and held it in her lap without opening it. The leather was worn to the exact softness of something handled often and with care. She retied the ribbon and put it back. She would not be frightened by a woman who had not yet arrived. Mrs. Price had been managing this house for more than 20 years.
She believed she knew exactly what the Dowager Duchess would do, and had given Eleanor what she considered a kindness, a preparation. But there was a question in that kindness that Mrs. Price had not fully examined. Was she warning Eleanor for Eleanor's sake? Or was the warning itself, in some way she had not quite decided to admit to, also a test? The cottage was at the eastern edge of the park, past the kitchen garden, half hidden behind a stone wall built sometime in the previous century and repaired without great consistency since. Eleanor found it by accident on a Sunday afternoon in mid-January, following the smoke rising from the chimney out of the simple curiosity of someone who, on a half-day walk, has nothing more pressing to follow. The man who opened the door was very old, perhaps 75, with white hair and the stooped shoulders of considerable age, but eyes that were still sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He had a book in his hand. He looked at Eleanor over the rims without visible surprise. "You'll be the new archivist," he said, not a question. "I am," Eleanor said, slightly taken aback. "And you are—" "Ambrose Hutchins, librarian at Ashford Park for 37 years. He looked at her steadily. "Come in. You must have questions." She had questions. Mr. Hutchins was, as she quickly gathered, a man of very quiet and very considerable knowledge. He had come to Ashford Park as a young man, the same year the current Duke's father had inherited the title, and he had stayed through that generation and into this one, cataloging and mending and reading and knowing far more about the house and its history than anyone had thought to ask him. He had retired from the librarianship 5 years ago when his eyes made the close work difficult, and had been permitted to remain in the cottage at the current Duke's quiet direction, which was, Mr. Hutchins noted, about as warm a gesture as the Duke was in the habit of making. "He is a good man," Mr. Hutchins said, pouring tea from a pot that had been sitting on the hearth. "I have known him since he was 8 years old. He is a good man who was very thoroughly taught not to be." "His father?" Eleanor said. "His father was not cruel, not by any account I ever heard, but he believed very completely that emotion was a form of weakness, and that weakness had no place in a Duke's heir. He gave the boy a large library, and told him it was for reference only. He gave him an excellent education, and called it a tool. He gave him every advantage available to his rank, and carefully removed the pleasure from most of them."
Mr. Hutchins cleaned his spectacles on his waistcoat with the unhurried air of a man for whom this observation was simply a settled fact. Nobody ever showed him what it was to simply be at home somewhere. I think he has never known what that feels like. And his mother? Lady Margaret values rank above all other things. She is not unhappy, I don't think. I'm not sure she is capable of unhappiness, precisely, because I don't believe she is capable of attachment in the form that makes loss possible. She is effective. She cares for appearances, for precedent, for the correct ordering of things. He set his cup down. She will find you irregular, Miss Marsh. Mrs. Price has already suggested as much. Mrs. Price is a careful woman. He looked at Eleanor with the sharp and steady regard of someone who reads people with the same attention he gives to texts. But I think you are rather harder to remove than Mrs. Price believes. Why? Eleanor said. Because he reads with you. He said this with the calm simplicity of stating a known fact. In 37 years, I never once saw that library used in the evenings. He came to fetch documents, he came to return things. He never sat in it to read. Not once. In 37 years. A pause. Something has changed. The cottage was warm. The fire was generous. Outside the small window, the park was all winter gray and bare branches against a low sky. I should tell you something, Mr. Hutchins said. He set down his cup, rose slowly, and went to the bookshelf on the far wall. A different kind of collection from the library at the house. Smaller books and older ones, arranged with the personal logic of a man who has lived with them for decades. He ran a hand along the spines, not searching, but going directly to something he knew exactly where to find. He returned with a slim volume. He set it on the table between them. It was a journal, leather-bound, dark brown, worn soft at the corners, with a clasp that had been broken and mended with a length of ribbon. Eleanor looked at it. Her heart did something she was not prepared for. I thought, Mr. Hutchins said quietly, that you might know that handwriting. She looked up at him. He looked back steadily. When was she here? Eleanor said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that.
The summer of 1794, he said. She came with Lady Ashford, the first Lady Ashford, who was the current Duke's aunt by marriage, a woman of great warmth and considerable education. They were close friends. The woman who wrote in your journal, I never knew her full name. She was called Anne. She was of Italian and English descent, and she was, he paused carefully, a woman of considerable intelligence and no particular standing. She stayed 2 months. She and Lady Ashford corresponded after she left. Another pause. I knew she had had a child. I did not know more than that until now. Eleanor looked at the second journal on the table, then at her own hands. She was Italian on her mother's side, she said. Her mother was a widow of Venetian origin. Mr. Hutchins watched Eleanor with the careful attention of someone delivering something fragile. Her name was Julia. I remember it because Lady Ashford used it once, in a letter she asked me to post. The room was very still. The fire ticked quietly behind its grate. Julia Mancini. Eleanor looked at Mr. Hutchins. The trust document, she said, quietly, not as a question. Yes, he said. And in his eyes she saw that he had been carrying this for a very long time, and was not sorry to be sharing it. Was it coincidence that Eleanor's particular skills brought her to this particular archive, in this particular house, where an old man sat in a cottage holding the other half of something she had been carrying without knowing it? Or was it the kind of thing that looks, in retrospect, less like coincidence and more like a long and patient arrangement of which we are always the last to be told? It was on the last night of January that everything between them shifted, not with any announcement, not with drama, but in the way that water changes temperature, almost invisibly, and then all at once. The Duke came to the library later than usual. Eleanor heard the corridor clock strike 10:30 and was reaching for her candle to take herself to bed when the door opened. He looked tired, not the ordinary tiredness of a long day, the other kind, the kind that lives behind the eyes and has been there, she suspected, for years, without the person it belongs to acknowledging it.
He did not speak. He went to the fireplace, added wood, and stood with his back to her for a moment. Eleanor set down her candle and waited. "Continue what you were doing," he said.
"I was about to stop," she said. "Stop later." She picked up her notebook. She had been drafting a letter to a book dealer in London and continued writing. The fire grew from embers to something steady and warm. The smell of the room was the smell she knew by now: wood smoke and old leather and beeswax and the dry coolness of aged paper. After 10 minutes, he sat down in the leather chair. After 15, he said, without apparent transition from anything else, "My father's solicitors found a document very like the one you translated, 30 years ago. They determined it was invalid under English law and filed it." Eleanor looked up. "They may have been right," he said. "I have asked Aldgate to determine whether they were." He was looking at the fire. "The point is that the document was found by solicitors paid to find such things and filed, and your document was placed in a box." A pause. "One of those two things was an oversight. The other may not have been." "You think someone left it undiscovered deliberately?" "I think it is possible." He looked at her directly. "What do you think?" Eleanor considered. "I think the same. The document was at the bottom of a box that had a date label. It was not a box of unsorted loose papers. Someone would have had to put it there, in a box dated 32 years after the document itself was written." "Yes," he said. Silence. The clock in the corridor struck 11. The Duke leaned back in his chair. He had the look of a man deciding whether to say something he has not said to anyone. "My father was not a dishonest man," he said. "I have always believed that. But he was careful in ways that were not entirely without question." A long pause. "He owed money, at one point, to a man who died before the debt was cleared. The land those tenant farms stand on was used as collateral during that period." He stopped. "I am not suggesting what it sounds like I may be suggesting." "No," Eleanor said. "But you are thinking it." He looked at her. "You can think things without suggesting them," she said, "especially things about your own father. It is a somewhat different kind of thinking." The fire cracked. Outside, the wind moved through the park with the low sound it made in winter, when there were no leaves to complicate it. He said, almost to himself, "My father never sat in this room." "No?" "He came to fetch things. Books he needed for reference. Documents. Nothing more."
He never read for pleasure. He considered it indulgent. The ghost of something moved across his face. He gave this library to the house as a kind of statement, that the house was civilized, that the family had culture. He cared about that appearance enormously. He turned the glass in his hand. He did not care about the contents. Eleanor looked at the shelves around them. 2,300 books, almost none of them read. "He gave you a great deal," she said carefully, "and arranged for you not to enjoy it." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then, simply, "That is precisely what he did." "Is that why—" She stopped herself. He looked at her. The firelight was warm on his face, and in the amber light he was, for once, entirely readable. "Why what?" "Why you asked me to read," she said. "That first night. You could have told me to leave. You could have had a fresh copy of the Virgil sent from London and read it yourself without difficulty. But you asked me to read it to you." She paused. "I thought about it afterwards. I wondered if it was because asking was different from doing it yourself. If someone else is reading, the pleasure is not precisely yours. It is simply something happening in the room. It does not count the same way. It is not the indulgence he forbade. Is that it?" He was very still. "If that is not what you meant," she said quietly, "forgive me. I have—" "Yes," he said. The word fell into the room with the weight of something that has been held in for a long time. "I suppose that is exactly it," he said. Eleanor held her notebook and did not look at him, because she understood that certain kinds of honesty are easier to speak when the person hearing it is not watching. After a while, he said, "My mother is arriving next week." "I know. Mrs. Price mentioned it. Mrs. Price is thorough." He rose from the chair. "My mother will have opinions about your position here." "I expect she will," Eleanor said. He looked at her steadily. "The Italian document and your translation are in Aldgate's hands.
Your work on this archive is documented and will continue to be. Your value to this household is a matter of record." She understood what he was saying. He was not saying it as warmth. He was saying it the only way he knew how, as information, as something concrete she could hold on to. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said. He inclined his head and moved toward the door. He stopped. "I have not asked your given name," he said.
"Eleanor," she said. He said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, in passing, "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Your Grace." The door closed. Eleanor sat in the warm library for a long time. She was aware that something had shifted between them. Quietly, without announcement, like a deep thing that has been moving for weeks and has only now made itself felt against the surface. She was also aware that she could not afford to want it, not in any ordinary sense. She held both of those things at once, and found for the first time in a long time that the second was simply and entirely difficult to believe. He had said her name. Once, quietly, in passing. The way a man says the name of something he is beginning to understand is significant. Did he know what he was doing? And more to the point, did she? The journal appeared in the middle of things, as journals do. Eleanor had been carrying it for 24 years, since the Reverend had pressed it into her hands when she was small enough that its weight surprised her. "This was your mother's," he had said. "Keep it carefully." She had. She had read every page more times than she could count. The careful English paragraphs in the first half, the French passages that were more personal and more anxious, the Italian near the end where the handwriting changed quality, became more hurried, as though the writer had less time or less certainty, or both. She had never fully understood those Italian pages. For years her Italian had not been equal to them. Over the last 5 years she had pieced them together. But understanding the words and understanding what they meant were still, in places, two separate things. She brought the journal to Mr. Hutchins on a Sunday afternoon in the first week of February. He read the Italian pages carefully, his lips moving slightly, pausing sometimes to find a phrase. His own Italian was old, acquired during a period in his youth when he had accompanied a young nobleman on an extended journey through the north of the country, but it was enough. He translated slowly, handing her the words as he found them. The Italian pages were letters, not written to send, or written to send and never sent, or written as a kind of rehearsal for a sending that never came. They were addressed to a woman called Julia, and they were signed only with the letter A. "Cara Julia, I have told no one. I do not know whether telling anyone would make things better or worse." He was kind, and I have never regretted what happened between us. But kindness does not create obligations, and I would not want anyone obligated on my account. The child is well. She has his eyes, whatever that means when the father is someone who cannot be named openly. Eleanor listened to Mr. Hutchins read this and was very still. "I have written to the Reverend in Suffolk. He is a good man, a genuinely good man, and he will not ask questions I cannot answer. If I die before she is grown, and I am not well, Julia, I have not been well since the autumn, I want her to have the journal, so that she can find you if she chooses, so that she knows she came from somewhere real and that she was wanted, whatever the rest of the world may say about the circumstances." Mr. Hutchins stopped. The cottage was warm. The fire was high. Eleanor could hear her own breathing and the small sound of wind under the cottage door. "She died," she said, not a question. "In the spring of 1794, he said. He had removed his spectacles and was holding them. His expression was careful and full of something old. She had been at the house for 2 months. She fell ill in March and did not recover. Lady Ashford's own physician attended her." He paused. "She spoke Italian in her fever. I was one of the people who sat with her in those last days. She asked at the end for a woman named Julia." Eleanor looked at the journal in her lap, the worn leather, the faded ribbon. "Julia Mancini," she said. "Yes," he said, "which means that the trust document you found in the archive, the deed dated 1791, establishing a trust for Julia Mancini and her descendants, describes your great-grandmother."
He held her gaze with the steady kindness of a man who has been patient a very long time. You are a descendant of Julia Mancini. The conditions of that trust, if they are valid, may apply to you. The word descended into the warm room like a stone into still water, sending its rings outward without sound. It would mean, Eleanor said, very carefully, that I have some kind of legal connection to this estate. Possibly. Aldgate would know the law better than I. But there is a document, properly signed and witnessed, and there is a lineage that can be traced, and there is a woman who appears to have known about it and came here. He paused. Came here twice. Once with Lady Ashford, and once... He stopped. Eleanor looked up.
Once, in connection with the man your mother described as your father, he said. He met her eyes. A man this house knows. The fire ticked quietly in the cottage grate. The wind moved outside. His Grace does not know any of this, Eleanor said. No, said Mr. Hutchins. I did not know it myself, not the whole of it, until you brought me the journal. I knew your mother had been here. I had not connected her to the trust document. That connection? You made it. Eleanor looked at the journal. She thought of the 3 months in the library. She thought of the Virgil and the Italian verse and the evenings, and the one time he had said her name. She thought of having sat in his archive and catalogued the legal record of her own existence without knowing it. She felt the weight of it, not with distress exactly, but with the particular vertigo of a life that has been building towards something without consulting you. I will need to think about what to do, she said. Yes, Mr. Hutchins said. Take your time, but not too much of it. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has watched this house through 37 years of its history. The Dowager Duchess arrives Thursday. The journal had been in Eleanor's hands for 24 years. She had read every page. She had believed she understood it. And yet the most important thing in it, the answer to the question that had shaped the whole of her life, had been written in a language she could not fully read until now. What might she have done differently if she had known it sooner? And what, now that she did know, what was she going to do? Lady Margaret Ashford arrived on a Thursday in the first week of February with 2 carriages, 4 personal servants, and the expression of a person who has never had cause to doubt their own position and finds doubt in others mildly tedious. She was tall and stroke-backed, and dressed in the deep, permanent colors of a woman who stopped concerning herself with fashion decades ago and chose authority instead. She had the Duke's gray eyes, or rather the Duke had hers, and they assessed rather than simply observed. Eleanor encountered her for the first time on the morning of the second day in the corridor outside the library. The Dowager Duchess was conducting what appeared to be a methodical tour of the East Wing, with Mrs. Price in attendance. She stopped when she saw Eleanor. Mrs. Price said, with perfect composure, Your Ladyship, this is Miss Marsh. She has been engaged to organize the library and archive. I know who she is, the Dowager Duchess said. She looked at Eleanor with the brief, complete assessment she gave to all things, thorough and without warmth. Miss Marsh, you come from Bath. Yes, your ladyship. Through an agency, with references from a deceased clergyman. She paused on this detail, the way one pauses on a minor inconvenience. Your family background is... The pause did its own work. Unclear. My guardian was a clergyman in Bath, Eleanor said. Her voice was level. She was aware of keeping it so. I have no other family that I know of. The Dowager Duchess looked past Eleanor toward the library door. Edward tells me you have been useful with the archive. I hope so, your ladyship. Useful is one thing, she said. She looked at Eleanor again with the expression of a woman applying a known standard to a new subject. You will find, Miss Marsh, that this house has particular expectations about who occupies which positions and in what capacity. The archive work is entirely appropriate for your position. She paused. I am told you spend the evenings in the library. I work late sometimes, your ladyship. With his grace, she said. He uses the library in the evenings, occasionally,
Yes. The Dowager Duchess said nothing for a moment. Then, I see. She moved past Eleanor toward the library door, which caused Eleanor to step aside, and Mrs. Price followed, and Eleanor was left standing in the corridor with the fading traces of the Dowager's perfume in the cold air. She thought, and so it begins. The campaign that followed was not direct. The Dowager Duchess was far too intelligent for direct. It was the accumulation of small and careful things. A question at dinner about the wisdom of employing women of uncertain origin in positions of particular trust. A remark to Mrs. Price, overheard by the parlour-maids and transmitted through the servants' hall, about the danger of a clever woman making herself indispensable in ways that exceeded her sanctioned role. A suggestion, made to Mr. Oldgate on his next visit, that it might be appropriate to have the Italian document's translation verified by a professional whose credentials were beyond question. Eleanor heard all of this.
Servants' halls know everything, and she had been at Ashford Park long enough to be part of the information that moved through them. She said nothing. She kept working. She completed the catalogue, all 2,312 volumes, indexed by language, by subject, and by approximate date of publication, and presented it to the Duke on the 14th of February, bound in a cardboard cover she had made herself. He read through it in silence for several minutes. "This is excellent work," he said. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Complete the archive in the same manner," he said. "The entire archive, including the storage below." He looked up. "Whatever is there should be known." She understood what he was saying. He was saying it clearly enough. "I will begin on Monday," she said. She left the study knowing that whatever his mother was preparing, he was aware of it, and was, in his particular way, preparing something of his own. The question was which arrangement would reach its conclusion first. The Dowager Duchess had been managing her son's life, at a careful distance, for 33 years. She had never before encountered a woman in this house who was simultaneously below her son's reach by every conventional measure, and in possession of knowledge that changed the nature of reach entirely. If she had understood what Eleanor now knew, would she have moved faster? The blow came on a Friday evening, at a small dinner the Duke had arranged for 3 county families. Eleanor had known about it, and had arranged to be absent, taking her supper early in the servants' hall, and returning to the library to work. It came to her anyway. She heard about it first from Thomas the footman, who appeared at the library door at 9:30 with the expression of someone who has been sent to deliver something he would prefer not to deliver. "Mrs. Price asks if you'd come to the housekeeper's room, miss. Now, if you will." Eleanor set down her pen. Of course. Mrs. Price was waiting in the corridor, not in the room, which meant she wanted to speak quickly and without sitting down. "Her ladyship spoke at dinner," Mrs. Price said, without preamble, "about your background, specifically about the question of your birth." Eleanor said, "What did she say?" "She said that inquiries she had made indicate that you were born outside of marriage, to a woman of no family and no standing." She said this was a matter of record in the parish register of the village where you were raised. A pause. She said it in front of the Hartley family, and the Cole family, and the Venables. The corridor was cold. The smell of the house at that hour, extinguished candles and old stone, and the distant last traces of the dinner still in the air, was around her. "It is true," Eleanor said quietly. "I was born outside of marriage." "Yes," Mrs. Price said. "I know." "She knew before she arrived," Eleanor said. "She has been looking for it." "Yes." Mrs. Price's voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone delivering a fact that cannot be made easier by the manner of its delivery. "His Grace." She stopped. She looked at Eleanor with an expression that was, for the first time Eleanor could remember, not quite neutral. "He said nothing at dinner." The silence that followed carried its full weight. "I see," Eleanor said. "It is late," Mrs. Price said. "You should go to bed." Eleanor went back to the library. She sat in the leather chair beside the cold fireplace. The candles were burning low. The room was quiet in the way that very late rooms are quiet. A stillness that has settled and has no intention of being disturbed. She thought. He said nothing.
She was honest with herself, as she always was, and did not try to explain this away. She thought of the walk from Bath, of the grey wool dress, of the Virgil, of his voice saying her name once, quietly, in passing. She thought, he said nothing. She rose. She went to the shelf where she had placed, weeks ago, the Italian verse collection. She held it for a moment. Then she put it back. She went to her room. She packed her bag. She was methodical about it. Her 2 dresses, her Bible, her comb, her pen and ink. The employment agency's long outdated letter, which she no longer needed but had kept out of habit. And last, at the bottom, the journal, wrapped in its shawl. She lifted the bag. She stood at the door of her room. She was held there for a moment by the specific weight of what she was leaving. Not the room, which had been cold and spare, and had never particularly felt like hers. What held her was the library, the archive, Mr. Hutchins in his cottage, the particular warmth of the firelight in the evenings, and the sound of Latin read aloud into a quiet room. She took a breath. She went out. She was halfway down the main staircase, at midnight, when she heard her name.
Not Miss Marsh, not a title or a position. Eleanor. She stopped. He was at the foot of the stairs. He was still dressed. He had not been to bed. He was looking up at her, and his expression was the one she had never seen on his face before, and which she could not now pretend not to recognize it. Not the careful neutrality, not the focused attention. Something else. Something that was, in a man who did not allow himself distress, the nearest available thing to it. She stood on the stair with her bag in her hand. "Where are you going?" he said. "I think you know," she said. He said, "I know what my mother said at dinner." He paused. "I did not say anything because I did not know she intended to say it. I was not—" He stopped. "I was not prepared." "I understand," Eleanor said. And she did. She understood it as a fact, even if understanding it did not make the staircase any warmer or the bag in her hand any lighter. "I am not asking you to stay for my sake," he said. "I am asking because—" He ran a hand through his hair, which she had never once seen him do, and which told her more than anything else how much the evening had cost him. "You found this house. You found that document in my archive. You sat in that library with me without requiring anything of me that I could not give. And I am—" He stopped again. "I am not accustomed to that." She stood on the stair. She thought, "Don't." She thought, "He said nothing at dinner." She thought, "He is here now, at midnight, at the foot of the stairs." She said, "Your mother said something that was true." "Yes," he said. "She said it in front of people to cause me harm." "Yes, she did." His voice had lost, for the first time she could remember, its maintained temperature. "That is not the same thing as my having nothing to say." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought of all the warnings she had received. She thought of Mr. Hutchins in his cottage, of the journal, of the Italian pages she had learned to read in order to find out who she was. She thought of the Virgil, and the words she had read into a cold room while the last fire burned low, and he had sat across from her and listened as though she were something worth listening to. She set down the bag. Not because she had made a decision, or not entirely, not yet. Because she wanted to hear the rest of what he had to say, and because, on a cold staircase in the middle of the night, she was not yet ready to stop wanting that.
She set down the bag. That was all. One small action on a cold staircase at midnight. And yet, is there anything larger sometimes than the decision to stop walking away from the thing that frightens you and simply stay to find out what it is? The dinner was a week later. In the days between the staircase and the dinner, several things happened. Mr. Aldgate came with 2 colleagues and spent 2 full days in the archive. Eleanor worked alongside them, translating, explaining, locating documents with the precise speed of someone who has cataloged 2,000 items and can find any of them in under a minute. At the end of the second day, Mr. Aldgate sat down in the library and said to the Duke, "The document is valid. The trust is active. The lineage is traceable." A pause.
We have a situation of some considerable unusual character. Yes, the Duke said. I know. Eleanor said nothing. Mr. Hutchins came to the house twice that week. The first time, he brought his copy of the journal, the one that had sat on his shelf for 40 years, and handed it directly to the Duke. The Duke read it that evening in the library while Eleanor worked at the table. He did not speak when he finished. He set the journal on the table and looked at the fire for a long time. The second time, Mr. Hutchins brought a letter, very old, in Lady Ashford's handwriting, addressed to Anne and never sent, found inside a Venetian almanac he had kept since the summer of 1794. It had been there, unread, for nearly 25 years. The letter named Eleanor's father. She read it standing in the cold archive room. The name was not unknown to her. She had encountered it in county records, in passing, the way one encounters names attached to old houses and old debts. He had been dead for 20 years. He had had no legitimate children. He had been, in some accounts, a difficult man, and in others, not unkind. She folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the journal. She continued working. The dinner the Duke arranged for the last Friday of February was larger than the previous one. He invited the 3 county families and 3 more besides. He invited his mother, which was a courtesy she could not decline without making her position visible in a way that would not have served her. Eleanor was not invited as a guest.
She was asked by the Duke directly to be in the drawing room after dinner for a specific purpose he described in approximately 12 words. You will need to be present. Bring the journal. She came. She stood in the drawing room doorway in her gray wool dress, her hair pinned up more carefully than usual, the journal in her hands. Every eye in the room moved to her. The Dowager Duchess's expression, across the room, was the expression of a woman who has seen a move she did not anticipate from a player she had underestimated. The Duke rose. He crossed the room to Eleanor's side. He said to the room, with the complete calm of a man who has decided, Ladies and gentlemen, I wish to introduce Miss Eleanor Marsh, who has been managing the library and archive of this estate for the past 4 months. He paused. In that time, she has catalogued 2,312 volumes, organized 40 years of unexamined archive material, identified and translated a legal document of material significance to this estate, and done all of this with a precision and intelligence that I have not encountered in any person who has worked in this house within my memory. Another pause. She has accomplished this while being the subject of the kind of scrutiny we reserve, in this county, for people whose origins we find inconvenient. The room was very still. The candles burned steadily in their brackets. Outside the tall windows, the park was dark and the sky was clear. Miss Marsh's birth was irregular by the common measure, the Duke continued. Her mother was a woman of English and Italian descent who died young and left her in the care of a clergyman. Her father was Lord Henry Whitfield of this county, who died in 1802 without legitimate issue, and whose name is engraved on the memorial in the church 3 miles from where we are standing. The silence had a different quality now. The trust document Miss Marsh found in this estate's archive establishes a legal claim, which, once examined by my solicitors, has been found valid under current law. It applies to property that has formed part of this estate for 3 generations. The document was not found by my solicitors. It was found by Miss Marsh. He looked, for the first time, directly at his mother across the room. His expression was entirely composed. I am aware that questions have been raised about the propriety of Miss Marsh's position here. I wish to resolve those questions this evening. He turned to Eleanor. He took the journal from her hands. Carefully, with both hands, as one takes something known to matter. He set it on the table beside him. Then he said, to the room and to his mother and to Eleanor herself, in one clear and unhurried sentence, I intend to marry Miss Marsh. I am stating this now, so that if anyone wishes to dispute it, they may do so while I am present to respond. Nobody appeared to wish to dispute it. The Dowager Duchess's face did not change. It was the face of a woman who has encountered an unexpected move and is, beneath the composure, recalculating. Eleanor thought she was, in that moment, doing the arithmetic of what it would cost her to continue the fight versus what it would cost her to accept the outcome. The Hartley family began to applaud. After a moment's hesitation, the room followed. Eleanor stood in her gray wool dress with the fire warm behind her and the sound of applause around her, and she was aware of the journal on the table beside the Duke and of the particular quality of the light in the room, warm, unambiguous, and of the weight and the specific realness of the moment. She thought of the Reverend, who had pressed a leather journal into the hands of a small girl and said, "Keep it carefully." She thought of her mother, writing in Italian in the dark to a woman she hoped her daughter might one day find. She thought of a cold library, and the Virgil, and the first page, and the voice that had said, "Read it to me." She thought, yes, I can. He had made a choice, not in calculation alone, though there was calculation in it, as there is in all things worth doing carefully. He had made it in public, at cost, in front of his mother and the county, and his own long habit of not declaring anything. What had it taken him to arrive at that sentence? And what had Eleanor given up on that cold staircase when she set down her bag? They were married in March, in the village church 3 miles from Ashford Park, on a morning when the frost was still on the ground, but the first primroses had appeared along the churchyard wall, pale yellow, small, entirely certain of themselves. Mr. Hutchins attended. He sat in the front pew on Eleanor's side, which was also the shorter side, and he held his hat in both hands and looked at her with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has been patient for 37 years and finds, in this moment, that the patience has been entirely well spent. Mrs.
Price attended from professional duty and wept into a handkerchief from the 6th pew. Eleanor saw this, and she was quite certain that if she had ever mentioned it, Mrs. Price would have denied it with complete conviction. Mr. Aldgate attended, carrying a leather portfolio under his arm, which he presented to Eleanor on the church steps in the thin March sunlight. "The relevant documents," he said. "The trust is formally recognized and incorporated into the estate title. You are, technically, both the heir and the original subject of the claim under 2 distinct legal instruments." He paused, searching for the precise language for an unusual situation. "It is somewhat unprecedented." "I am somewhat unprecedented," Eleanor said. Mr. Aldgate appeared to find this an accurate assessment. The Dowager Duchess did not attend the wedding. She had departed Ashford Park the week after the drawing-room announcement, returning to her house in London with the composure of a woman who does not allow situations to be seen to have cost her. She sent her son a letter, which he read and did not share. Eleanor did not ask about it. Some things between a man and his mother were private, and Eleanor was not in the habit of requiring what was not offered. They had spoken of it once, the evening before the wedding. "She is not wrong about everything," the Duke said. He was standing at the library window, looking out at the dark park. "She is not a good person in the sense that some people are not good, not through cruelty, but through never having required it of herself. The world rewarded her thoroughly for being precisely what she is. It is very difficult to change into a different thing when the version of yourself you have always been has been so consistently successful." "You sound almost sympathetic," Eleanor said. "I sound accurate." He turned from the window. "She will come around eventually, because the alternative is forfeiting this house entirely, and she values this house more than she values most people in it." He looked at Eleanor. "I am not asking you to like her." "Good," Eleanor said, "because I am not yet equal to that task." Something moved in his face, the thing that had been, over the course of these months, becoming more recognizable and more frequent, like a feature of the landscape that appears gradually as the weather improves. "You will tell me when you are," he said. "You will be among the first to know," she said. What became of them in the years that followed? Eleanor Marsh, Eleanor Ashford now, completed the catalogue of the entire estate archive by the summer of their first year. In doing so, she found 3 further documents of legal interest, none as dramatic as the trust deed, but each materially useful. She also began, that same summer, to write a catalogue of the estate's historical records that became, in time, a small monograph circulated among historians and eventually archived at a library in London. The acknowledgments noted that the work had been made possible by access to the private archive of the Ashford estate and by the generosity of the late Ambrose Hutchins, who had been librarian there for 37 years. Mr. Hutchins died in the autumn of their second year, in his cottage, with a book open in his lap and the fire burning well. The Duke arranged the burial himself, without being asked, in the village churchyard where the primroses grew. Eleanor sat with him in the cottage on the last evening and read to him from the journal he had kept. The second one, the one that had been waiting on his shelf for 40 years. He went quietly, between one page and the next, with the fire warm and the wind outside gentle. Mrs. Price remained head housekeeper at Ashford Park for 11 further years. She never entirely stopped being Mrs. Price, which Eleanor found she preferred. There was, after the third year, an understanding between them that was not quite friendship, but was in the vicinity of it. The kind of understanding between two practical women who have, after some honest observation, determined that they respect each other. Mrs. Price brought Eleanor tea in the library on cold evenings without being asked. Eleanor never mentioned the blanket. The Duke of Ashford was, in the opinion of those who knew him well, a changed man, though changed was perhaps not precisely right. He was the same man. He was simply no longer entirely prevented from being him. The library was used. The fire was kept burning. The evenings were no longer silent. He rode in the mornings and came home to a house that was, in the specific and particular sense of the word, a home. He read. He had always been capable of it. It was the specific guilt attached to pleasure, the pleasure of a man who had been taught to distrust it, that had kept him from it.
In the first years of their marriage, Eleanor read to him in the evenings, and he listened in the way of someone allowing themselves something that has been forbidden for a long time. After the first year, he began to read alongside her. After the second, he brought her books he had found and placed them on the table beside her chair, without comment, the way you offer something to someone whose preferences you have come to know as well as your own. Eleanor kept the journal. It sat on the shelf in the library, between the Virgil and the Italian verse collection, in the place she had given it the week after the wedding. She took it down sometimes and read it, not because she needed to, she had long since memorized every word, but because it had been her mother's, and because having it meant that a woman who had not intended to be forgotten had not been. The primroses came back every year along the churchyard wall. On the morning of their third march, the Duke found Eleanor in the library before he had come down, standing at the window with the journal in her hands and the early spring light on her face. He stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking. Then he came in and sat down in his chair and waited. She put the journal back on the shelf. She turned around. She said, "Read me something." He picked up the Virgil. He found the first page. He read, "Arma virumque cano, Troiae qui primus ab oris." And perhaps that is the simplest way to say what all of it had been about. Not titles, not trust deeds, not drawing rooms or county dinners, or the careful arrangements of families with long memories. It had been about a room, and two people in it, and a book that was always meant to be opened. About what happens when a woman who has spent her whole life being invisible is finally, quietly seen. Not by the world, not by a drawing room full of county families, but by one person, at midnight, in the light of a dying fire. What happens is not always what you expect. What happened here was this. A man learned that pleasure and indulgence are not the same thing, and a woman learned that she was allowed to want. What happens in the end when someone who has never been seen is finally looked at? And what happens to the person doing the looking? That is a question each of us must answer for ourselves.